Hi, everybody. I'm Greg Benchwick. It's great to be here as part of the National Biodiversity Teach-In. I was so excited to learn about this because I'm a huge Martha fan, and to see that students came up with the idea because of Martha to come up with this teach-in, I was just really thrilled. I wanted to tell you a little bit about myself. Number one, I wrote a book, a children's book called Martha, the Last Passenger Pigeon. It's for kids that are about 8 to 12. It's called a mid-grade chapter reader, and it's based on true historic events about Martha, but it's totally made up. For my day job, I work for the United Nations Development Program, UNDP, as a communications specialist. So I work especially on climate change. I am not here officially for the United Nations member states, or anybody related to the United Nations. I'm here as an author and as somebody that's passionate about conservation and biodiversity. You know, and other than that, I live in Colorado. It's a snow day here. We got about 6 inches of snow on the ground. It's my kids out of school, so you may see a group of 9-year-olds truck in through here with their sleds at some point during the presentation. As we go, feel free to ask any questions. I am here to answer them. I have my chat box open and I'm ready to answer them. So let's jump into things. I think you can all see the presentation, the PowerPoint. I just wanted to really have an open discussion about Martha and why I wrote the book and what the book has to offer. So, you know, the story is actually based on real life events. Everybody, I think, may know that there really was a passenger pigeon named Martha, and she was born in captivity in the Cincinnati Zoo in 1895. She died in 1914, and she was the last of her breed. When she died, that's right at the start of the First World War. Your grandpa might have called it the Great War. Our collective humanity was marked with a giant scar. Once the most abundant bird species in the world, numbering in the billions, the passenger pigeon was no more. Other parts of the story are totally made up, by the way. We all know that animals can't talk, but as I say in the prologue, if they could talk, would we listen? So this is Martha. It's amazing that this was the last bird that we ever knew of this species. And she can actually be seen today still at the Smithsonian. And you can probably go to any local natural history museum and see preserved passenger pigeons. They're actually here in Denver at our local history museum as well. I've been researching Martha and other endangered species for about 5 years in my efforts to write a children's book for my daughter primarily, who's 9, but also for kids worldwide, about the importance of conservation and environmental protection. What's become perfectly clear to me as I wrote and rewrote the book is that if we don't educate our children about conservation today, we're likely to experience a catastrophic loss of biodiversity that will alter the course of human and natural history forever. Think about how the lessons of Martha can be applied to the world today. Oops, sorry, skip pages there. Think about how the lessons of Martha can be applied today. Martha lived through a seminal time in American history that included the expansion west, industrialization, the Gilded Age, which was an age of conspicuous consumption. Anybody who has been recently to a Starbucks may have witnessed conspicuous consumption at its worst now, and the Gilded Age was no different. We became a very consumeristic society, and it had vast implications on the environment. There's also a huge population growth, lots of wars, nothing new there, right? And something called manifest destiny. If anybody's out there, you can tell me through the chats what manifest destiny was. But essentially, it was our national goal in the United States of being able to spread across the continent. In the US, we burned coal, we raped the land, we expanded our economies, and we became, before long, the greatest industrial empire the world had ever seen. That is the backdrop to this book. The book starts in, it's a kid's book. The birds can talk, but I'm going to talk a little bit more today about the actual science and the actual history of it. So one of the takes on writing Martha is that children need to know about this. If anybody has heard of George the snail died in Hawaii recently. He was the last of his breed. And he died at 14 years old. He was the last Achatinella apis fulva snail. I'm not sure if I said that right, on the planet. If anybody's been paying attention to Australia, we are maybe going to lose koala bears and other remarkable animals from the land down under. And we're also likely to lose the vast majority of our coral reefs. We need to learn about this. This is what we're calling at the UN and what world leaders should be calling planet Earth's sixth mass extinction. I'm going to go into some more details about this mass extinction later on. But in a nutshell, at our current unchecked and unbridled rates of conspicuous consumption, pollution, habitat loss, population growth, heating oceans, rising temperatures, and melting ice caps, we could lose as many as 1 million species in the next 30 years before 2050. That would mean they would follow Martha, the dodo bird, into the history. And an entire generation will miss out on the majesty and power and grace of wild gorillas, sea turtles, Bengal tigers, and polar bears. Most people in this classroom will also never experience the Great Barrier Reef at its most beautiful and resplendent, as so much of the world's barrier reefs are being bleached and being literally wiped out by rising ocean temperatures. This is also something, we talk about biodiversity, but biodiversity affects human populations as well. So this lack of control, environmental controls, and lack of protection is also pushing communities to the edge. This means that children living in the developed world may not have enough to eat. It means hunger, it means poverty, and it means chaos in our world. So I really think that we need to teach about these things and start the conversation. During my research, I was really floored to learn that more than half of US school teachers do not teach climate change in their schools. You guys are doing something great. You're changing that. I thought we were past it with the Scopes monkey trial. Here we are today, and we are still skirting around a topic that 99% of scientists agree on. There is complete global consensus, and we have a 17-year-old Greta Thunberg who is leading a global movement to act on climate change. And believe me, countries are following up. Through the Paris Agreement, I believe over 150 countries have entered into the Paris Agreement and have agreed to a global effort and a global movement to stop climate change and adapt to some of the worst effects of the climate crisis, which are already coming to pass. This means giant floods. This means giant wildfires. This means in Colorado, we have half of our forest has been destroyed by a beetle. Now, this beetle would have normally been here in Colorado. It comes, it's cyclical, it comes all the time. However, because it's so warm in Colorado, now the beetle does not naturally die. So it would normally be frozen out of its environment, and what it did was eat half of our pine forest. And you go drive around the Colorado wilderness and you will see a decimated brown forests of dead pine trees. It's really tragic, and it is a direct impact from rising temperatures. So, meet the passenger pigeon. I think some of you might know more about the passenger pigeon than I do, actually. These guys were amazing. There was 3 to 5 billion of them in North America. This is the biggest bird species in modern history, certainly. And they looked, they kind of looked a little bit like a rock pigeon, that pigeon that you see in town all the time now, except for they were bigger and they were much faster. So they could fly up to about 50 miles an hour, I believe. And they look different. So the boy pigeons had this beautiful collar and beautiful crimson collar around them, and the ladies were a little more gray. So a lot of people might think of them as homing pigeons. They're completely different. Actually, homing pigeons are used to carry messages, and people even still today will race pigeons. So, I mean, I love pigeons and I love birds in general, but this was a completely different breed, and a breed that went away because of human interactions. I'll go a little more deeper into that as we continue on here. So the sixth mass extinction. This is really, really terrifying stuff. Since 1970, the US and Canada have lost as many as 3 billion bird species. That's 1 out of every 4 birds. If there's anything like a canary in a coal mine, that is it. We are also losing our bees. So you remember the birds and the bees? That's how animals procreate. It's the baseline of our natural world. And the bees of our world are also at risk. This is happening in our wildlands because of a lot of human-induced reasons. Some of it is farming, mining, deforestation, overfishing, hunting and poaching, climate change, pollution, and the takeover of natural habitats by invasive species. Protecting these environments is very important to the future of humankind. Don't get me wrong, though, there are natural cycles. Mass extinctions are a regular occurrence on planet Earth, but the current extinction event is happening way faster than previous events, and it's man-made. They've even dubbed it the Anthropocene extinction, our current geological age marked by human activity dominating our planet's climate, ecology, and environment. In the book Martha, I call this the cycle of man. I don't know if you guys knew this, but oceans, forests, and other parts of our nature soak up 60% of global fossil fuels emissions every year. This is the lung that that our planet uses to breathe. So when we destroy the Amazon or have unchecked fires in Australia, or limit environmental protections in the United States, we are damaging our lungs and are creating our part of the problem that could literally pose an existential threat to humans and animals on planet Earth. We've had a lot of interesting history around mass extinction. Around 443 million years ago, we're talking, that's a long time ago, about 60-70% of all species were wiped out when a severe ice age led to a big fall in sea levels. Then 360 million years ago, in the late Devonian period, 70% of species were wiped out. This also included all the corals, just like today. Today, more than 90% of the world's corals will be gone by 2050 at current rates. The Permian-Triassic extinction event happened 250 million years ago, and more than 95% of species perished. This one was likely caused by a volcanic eruption in Siberia, which caused global warming. Global warming and temperature changes are nothing new. What is new is human-induced global warming and the rate at which it is happening. And the fact that it's not part of a natural Earth cycle, it's a part of a human cycle. Then we had the Jurassic 200 million years ago, where 1 in every 4 species on Earth were lost due to an increase in volcanism. 65 million years ago, a huge asteroid hit Mexico after some other large volcanic eruptions. And this was the end of the dinosaurs. Guess who took over? Mammals and eventually humans. And I see a question coming in from Deborah Perryman. I've heard that oceans are struggling as carbon sinks because the ocean chemistry is changing. That's right. I heard that by adding excess phosphate and nitrogen creates the dead zones, but it also makes it difficult for oceans to absorb carbon. Wondering if you've read that too. I have read that. This year, there's going to be a massive oceans conference with the UN, Deborah, and I think you should tune into that to see what is being done on a global level to protect our oceans, which are a key part of our natural ecosystems. Thanks for the question. So then after we lost the dinosaurs, we entered the Anthropocene. This mass extinction is underway. We can talk about future risks. What is happening today is climate change, environmental destruction are killing the world's biodiversity. And if we do not do anything about it, we're going to lose millions of animals. We are, in fact, losing dozens of species every day. Some of these might be just like George the snail, and they may be as big as Martha the passenger pigeon or as iconic as the koala. What I think is true is that we need to act today if we're going to address it. And this is not a future scenario anymore. This is a climate crisis. It's a nature crisis, and it needs to be addressed. So what's causing it? I think you've heard this before. Pollution, loss of rainforests in the world's corals, rising ocean levels, rising temperatures, human population growth and expansion, the loss of biodiversity, melting glaciers, upswings and violent storms, and other factors. In the book, I actually call it the 7 cycles of nature, and it's interesting that we're entering the cycle of man, and in the book we have 7 cycles of nature. So this is how I explain the 7 cycles of nature in the book. I hope you all check out the book. You can get it on Barnes & Noble or Amazon, or you can go to your local bookstore and order it. Anyhow, there's a learning guide at the end that unpacks a lot of this actual science that relates to the, the fun kids story of Martha and the wise owls and the talking, tom-fooling mice. So the 7 cycles of the universe is not always easy to explain. This comes from the book. In fact, I made it up. What's for certain is that 7 is an extremely magical number. This is true, way better than 2 or 3, in leaps bounds above 359. There are 7 colors in the rainbow, 7 deadly sins, 7 days in a week, and 7 heavens. It's a number and concept that extends across history and time. Some 40 years after Martha was born, somebody even invented 7-Up, and a little princess named Snow White made friends with 7 dwarves. In the animal kingdom, pigeons were born in the 7 cycles of the universe, whether they liked it or not. For the passenger pigeon, being part of the 7 cycles of the universe was not much more than a numbers game, and this is how it worked. This part isn't made up, so pay attention. Each year, the 5 billion passenger pigeons would have their babies. Only half the pigeons were old enough to have babies. That means that 2.5 billion were out there making little pigeon babies or chicks. Since half of those 2.5 billion were mamas and half were papas, and we all know it takes a mama and a papa to make a baby, that means there were about 1.25 billion pigeon couples trying to have babies. And since it takes an egg to make a baby, each couple would lay anywhere from 3 to 6 eggs in hopes that at least 2 would survive the great purge of spring. That's a whole bunch of eggs. Think about it, it's about 5 billion eggs being laid each year. That was the way the passenger pigeon survived. But life is not fair, and sometimes it's not kind. And many of the eggs would never hatch. Foxes would eat eggs by the dozen. Hawks would raid from above. Some would be trampled by wild boars. And before the U.S. was discovered, quote unquote, by the Europeans, Native Americans would take their fair share of eggs. Then came European descendant settlers who came to the U.S. and eventually expanded west into the traditional passenger pigeon habitat. They cut down beech trees. That's where the passenger pigeon loved to eat. And they killed millions of pigeons for food. They even set up nets to capture birds, kind of like I talk about in the book, from the bad boys, the Patsy brothers. So we have an exercise for everybody there. Scientists, this is a math time. Scientists say that as many as 30 to 50% of animal species could go extinct by 2050 if we take no action to end climate change or protect our planet. There are 6.5 million land species and 2.2 million ocean species on Earth today. How many species are there on total on the planet today? You guys got this? Let's hear it, Deborah. 8.7. Very good. My daughter also came up with that. I'm not so good at math, so I'm a little slower on that uptake. That's why I became a writer and not a scientist. So if we lose 30% of these animals, how many species will be left in 2050? I gotta use my calculator for this because I'm not so good. Anybody out there? I'm showing, Deborah, you got it? I'm showing a loss of 2.6 million, which would mean, help me out, folks, 2.6, 8.7 minus 2.6, 6 million. That's a lot. That's a lot of animals to lose. Hopefully we can turn that tide and avoid it. I love rhinos. I was recently in Ethiopia for a UN mission and in other parts of Africa. So I was in Zambia and Ethiopia, and I was lucky enough to see a rhino in the wild. There were 2,500 black rhinos left on the planet in 1995. Now, thanks to conservation efforts, there are 5,000 today. So amazing that we are able, when there's the will, there's the way, and we are able to preserve these species. But when we talk about the preservation of biodiversity, it's not just iconic species. We don't need to just preserve the Bengal tiger and the snow leopard and the koala bear and the black rhino. We need to preserve the George, the snails, and the bees in this world, the ones that come together to make the magical and wondrous natural ecosystem we have today. So I have a research project for you guys. Head to the library and do some research about your favorite animal and what types of efforts are underway to conserve that animal, its habitat, and also take a close look at how food chains affect this. So in the case of Martha, it could be that a loss of beech trees led to part of their demise, and it could mean that the bird species we are seeing lost today are a result of a lack of insects. Obviously, huge expansions in the use of pesticides are also causing this. So in the book, I talk a lot about the stars, and I don't. There's a tenuous link between stars and nature, but it is there. So let me explain it a little bit for you. Imagine what a starry night looked like in 1895 when Martha was born. There was no light pollution to block our view. Today, people on Earth can see around 10,000 stars with the naked eye. But that's the whole globe. So if you cut that number in half, it means on a given night, you can see close to 5,000 stars. Well, that's if you're in Capitol Reef in the middle of the Utah desert. If you live in a city, like most of us do, you will see far less than that. Recent estimates indicate that 80% of Americans can't see our galaxy, the Milky Way, anymore. Does it really matter? Well, some people say it does. Light pollution disrupts our sleep, and it makes wildlife confused. I was watching this nature documentary the other day. I forget the name of it, but these poor crabs were walking away. Oh no, they were turtles. These turtles were walking away from the beach and towards the light because they thought the light on land at a bar was the moonlight on the beach, on the ocean, and they were walking the wrong way. So this change in light does cause real problems for animals that rely on dark skies. It also, on a more humanistic perspective, I love going out and exploring wild areas with my daughter. She's 9 years old. Last summer, we took a 5-day river trip on the San Juan River through one of the most pristine parts of southern Utah in the deserts. And for the first time, I think, my daughter saw the Milky Way. We stayed up late and we watched the stars for just hours and marveled at it. And I really think that a disconnect with the stars is a disconnect with our natural world. I have some real favorite constellations in the book, and one of them has the number 7 in it because I love the number 7 so much. This is called the Pleiades. The star cluster, this is an interesting historic fact. The star cluster was formed about 100 million years ago. But the thing that I find most interesting about the Pleiades is that there are 6 bright stars that are visible to the human eye. Like any star cluster, there's a bunch of other stars there that you can see with a telescope, but you can't see them with the human eye. In fact, any of you that might drive a Subaru might recognize these because this is part of the logo of this Japanese car maker. And the word Subaru means unite. Oddly enough, the ancient Greeks called these the Seven Sisters. Was one more star in this cluster bright enough to see back then in Greek times without the light pollution we have today? Did they just like the number 7? Did another object in space block us from seeing the 7th star? There's nothing really, I don't know the answer to that. Maybe somebody can do some research and look into the history of it. But I find it fascinating, the history of the star, the magic of the number 7, and the change in our stars and how it's affecting our present world. Math time. Any of you out there? I don't even know if I can answer this one myself because I really, honestly, am not very good at math. I took math for poets when I was in college at the University of Colorado, and concentrated on humanities. But let's try to do it. Our galaxy, the Milky Way, contains 1 trillion stars. That's 1, 0, 0, 0, 0, 0, 0. Step 2, there are about 1 trillion galaxies in the universe. That's 1, 0, 0, 0, 0, 0. How many stars are there total? You add up the zeros to come up with this answer, or those of you that could do powers, probably most of you that are in middle school and high school can do this. There's a special way to write numbers that big. If there's a 10 with 3 zeros, it'd be 10 to the third power 3, and you add those up. There's also comments in the book which I really find fascinating, and one of the book's key features is a comet signals the birth of Martha. Comets are interesting in that they come back all the time. And actually, I did some research when I wrote Martha, and in 1895, when Martha was born, there was a comet Faye. The comet is 3.5 kilometers in diameter, and it's known as a periodic comet. It comes back every 7.5 years. The last time we saw it was in 2017, so I think we're expecting the return in the next 4 or so years. It'll be fascinating to see what it looks like and if you can actually see it with all the light pollution we have today. So, going on, one of the things that we'll move on to owl time. I came up with this concept of owl time in the book. Owl time is based on human time. I totally made it up, but the idea behind owl time is really interesting. So the book begins in 1895, and I said it in our year of the owl, 4,543,000. Many scientists say the Earth is about 4.543 billion years old, give or take 50 million years. So owl time is about, what would we say, 1,000 times slower than human time, but is based on real history. This is a hard one. We're going to do a little more math. How many owl years are there in human years? Hint, you have to move the decimal point. There's 4.543 million is the age, billion is the age of the Earth in human years. In the owl years, we do it as 4 million. Go ahead and you can do that math on your own. I know everybody loves doing math for fun. So, I mean, I think this is almost the most important part of it, and it's how I end the learning guide to my book. I talk about what we can do to save planet Earth and protect our biodiversity. There's a whole lot you can do to protect our wildlife and our environment and build a better world, and it starts with you. So go to the internet, your local library, your school, and start researching ways that you can help. I came up with my 7 easy steps to protect the planet, 7 things that I'm doing in my life and I'm having my daughter do in her life. And I would like you to come up with 7 steps of your own. My 7 steps are to buy less and reuse more. An average American throws away over 2,500 pounds of trash a year. Can you believe that? Recycling helps, but buying less is even better. Oh yeah, make sure you recycle and compost as much as you can too. We started a compost club at my daughter's school, and we've been composting at school, and later we'll be using it for the school's organic garden. And every spring in our house, we plant an organic garden and use our compost to fertilize the garden. It's super fun. The funnest part was last year we got some cayuga ducks, and they fertilized the garden, and were a wonderful part of our family for the summer. Second step, get out in nature. Whether you live in a big city or the countryside, chances are you don't spend that much time in nature. Take a trip to a local open space and see how many different types of animal species you can find in a day. I've been doing this on a regular basis with my daughter, and there's a new app. I don't know how new it is. It's called the Merlin Bird ID. It's from Cornell University, the Cornell Lab for Ornithology, which is, I think, the world's preeminent bird school. And you can go out and ID birds. This helps scientists also track the number of birds that are in your neighborhood. And it's super fun. They have all the birds listed there, and you can go and try to ID birds. My daughter loves it. We saw a coot yesterday, and of course it's Denver, so we saw a whole bunch of geese. My step number 3 is to form a school club. We did that at my daughter's school. It is called the Green Team, and they are recycling. They're building awareness around the school. They're composting, and they are just taking part in activism at the school level to try to make change happen. You can connect it with your friends and see what you can do to do that. Number 4, turn off the lights. That's a real easy one. Simple enough. You could also ask at your school or ask your parents about adding solar panels. Solar is now a very viable renewable energy in many parts of the world. It does pay for itself, and actually we are hitting that point where solar will be, and other renewable sources will be cheaper than coal. So we're going to see a massive switch to solar energy. Smart businesses will be future-proofing their energy needs by going to solar, and smart families and schools and governments will be doing the same thing. Number 5, I hate telling people what to eat, but eat less red meat. I love steak. Don't get me wrong. I love hamburger too, though the new Impossible Burger at Burger King, pretty good. But by simply not eating meat on Mondays, you can do a whole lot to protect the environment. Why is that? Well, you see, cows like to burp. Like they like to burp a lot. In fact, the methane they produce is a major greenhouse gas, heating up the atmosphere and causing the ice caps to melt and sea levels to rise. So by reducing the number of cows on the planet, we can lower the amount of greenhouse gases and help protect against climate change. Even better, implant an organic garden in your home. The food tastes great, it's amazing, and it's super fun. Number 6, I love to do this because it's almost always sunny in Colorado, except for when we have 6 inches of snow on the ground. Ride your bike. It's fun. It doesn't put any carbon into the atmosphere, and you can challenge your parents to ride to bike to school with you. I think if more people biked to school and more people worked where they lived, we would vastly lower our carbon footprint. And number 7, express your voice. Children across the globe are joining the fight to protect our planet from the climate crisis, to save endangered species, and to protect our environment. You can be involved at home, in your school, in your community, or even by telling a politician that you want real action, not just a lot of hot air. That one goes back to number 5 about the burping cows. So that's what I have today for you folks. I really hope that you join the global climate movement. I hope that you act on a local level to protect biodiversity. I hope that you learn about nature and get out in nature and explore it. And now I am open for questions. Oh, I see. I'm scrolling down here. I saw your question here. I was wondering if the large groups have important to their survival. Like, did the passenger pigeon have jobs like ants? So the loss of some of them might have been a loss of specific workers, or maybe they needed lots of noise. Hope that makes sense. Yeah, Deborah. So they survive because of their numbers. So many passenger pigeons were born each year. They almost doubled their flock size, and each year as many were taken by natural predation in the natural world. In the human world, what happened was it's really interesting. It's actually the telegraph and the train that are often cited as the primary causes for the passenger pigeon's demise. So how did that work? Well, suddenly, you didn't have to write a letter. I don't know if anybody here remembers what those are. You used to write a letter on paper, and the paper would go in an envelope, and that envelope would go into the mail, and then 10 to 20 to 40 days later, the person would get the letter and they would write you back. Well, suddenly, with the telegraph, you could talk instantly, and hunters actually were able to tell other hunters, we found the flock, let's go here and hunt. And they were able also to move things more quickly to market. So the train meant that that people could take pigeons that were made into pigeon pie, believe it or not, and they could take pigeons and bring them to mass market more quickly without spoilage. So the train and the telegraph were the main reasons for it. And not far around this time, the Intercontinental Railroad was formed. And I go into some of that history in the history section of the book. So the first transcontinental railroad was constructed around 1863 and 1869. And that is one of the things that caused the pigeon to end. I think you got the math question there, Jessica Hamilton. Good work. Are the stars important to the migration of the passenger pigeon? That's a very good question. I think birds use the Earth's gravitational field for navigation, but I am not an ornithologist, so I cannot accurately say that. That would require a little bit of research. Deborah, walk to work and work to school. Where are your favorite places to visit? Jessica, I think that's a good question for everybody as well. My favorite places to visit right now are the American West. So I love going out to Utah, to the Colorado Plateau, and adventuring on my raft. So we go out and we look at birds and we hang out under the stars in basically true wilderness. I am also writing a book about national parks for the publisher DK. That book will be coming out next year, and I'm talking a lot about Alaskan parks that I visited over the years for Lonely Planet. And I actually used to work up in Alaska in fish canneries when I was a young gun and had a lot of energy and could do that kind of thing. Alaskan parks are absolutely wild and vast and amazing. Many of these parks actually don't have roads in them. You have to fly there. And as we're seeing in current day, the US's EPA is one of the biggest unraveling of environmental protections has happened under the current US administration. We saw yesterday, I believe, protections for bears' ears in Utah are being lifted. So they will be moving fracking cranes into one of Utah's best wildernesses, and have also limited corporate responsibility about the killing of birds. So now corporations that go out into these areas to do oil exploration will not have to be called to task if they kill birds in the process. It's a terrible unraveling of the protections that were put in place, and it's a bad day for wilderness everywhere. And I see your question here, Deborah. I'm not sure, I don't know if everybody can see these. Mine number 7, walk to work and school, landscape so that the water falls from the sky and is absorbed in the soil and doesn't run off. That's a very important one. In fact, for the UN, we have a project in Uganda that is underway right now on wetlands restoration. Wetlands across the world have been devastated, and the water does run off, and then the earth, the quality of the soil and everything falls apart, and then the watershed there is also devastated. What we're finding at the UN is that ecosystem-based approaches are often as effective or more effective than gray approaches to climate change adaptation. So that would be things like rather than building a billion-dollar seawall, you would restore mangroves, which are part of the natural ecosystem and protect coastlines from coastal erosion. Rather than doing huge energy projects, you would restore wetlands, which provide food for people, provide ecotourism opportunities, and also capture greenhouse gases. So that's a wonderful insight from you, my friend Deborah. And where was your other 7 here? Well, let's see here. I just saw your other 7. Well, we'll continue on. Do you have any thoughts on the current efforts to remove protection for migratory birds? Yes, I mean, we've lost so many birds in the past years that we need to do everything we can to protect our bird life. Birds are an essential part of the natural world. And an essential part of our human existence. So yes, we need to protect the birds as much as we can. A question about the UN. What is the UN doing to combat climate change? Jessica, I see that. The UN has been at the heart of convening countries through the Conference of the Parties. These are the climate talks where the Paris Agreement, and that's how the Paris Agreement came about. So we've known about climate change for a long time now. We've known about human-induced climate change, and businesses have known about it for a long time. Even ExxonMobil knew about it back in the 70s, and they were doing research on climate change then. The UN is convening these national governments to make commitments. So what's happening right now is governments are making nationally determined contributions to our targets of growth below 2 degrees Celsius, keeping temperature rise below that, and helping societies adapt to climate change. So that is what we are doing now. The UNDP, where I work, has a climate promise to help scale up the ambition of these nationally determined contributions. We will be working with 100 countries in the next year to scale up the ambition of what they're doing. There is a problem in that several large polluters and global leaders have threatened to pull out of the Paris Agreement. The US is still party to it, or just now stepped out of the Paris Agreement, but we have an obligation, a human and moral obligation, I think, to honor the Paris Agreement and make good on it. It will not happen, however, if leading countries do not take part. The good thing about the US is that on a state level and on a private sector level, this is happening. So California, which actually is one of the largest economies in the world, I think if you look at California's economy, it would be close to a G8 country. And they have offered to honor the Paris Agreement, as have, I believe, about 20 US states. So it will be happening on a state level, and it's happening on a private sector level, because what businesses see is that climate is a risk to their survivability and their economic future. So if people across the globe are being pushed to migration because of desertification in the Sahara, and there is wars over scarce resources, this disrupts economies. If temperatures rise to a certain point, the farming is disrupted, our ability to feed people is disrupted. it's all interrelated, and this is what the UN is doing, and there are a variety of UN organizations doing it. So the UN Development Program where I work is working on it, but all UN organizations are, in a sense, working toward the goal on climate change. There's something called the Sustainable Development Goals that countries across the world have signed on to. One of those goals is climate action. Other goals are protecting life on land and on water. And this year, there's going to be a massive, massive conference on nature and biodiversity. So keep your eyes peeled on those things to see what happens. And if you follow UNDP on Facebook, I think in the next couple of weeks, you might even see a really super cool app about it. These topics are so scary. What gives you hope? Well, good question, Jessica, or was that from Deborah? Deborah, good question. Yeah, what gives me hope? My hope is in humanity. My hope is in the human spirit. My hope is in technology. So, you know, a lot of times I think back to before the car was invented. Before the car was invented, New York was literally lined with horse dung. There were entire economies built around removing horse dung. And eventually the automobile came about, and it was a paradigm shift away from horse dung. And then the automobile started to create more pollution, and is part of the current problem. So I think there will be a technological paradigm shift. I think about Copernicus and looking at the Earth not being the center of the universe, but the sun being the center of the universe. We need a huge paradigm shift in the way that we think about technology and the way we think about economy. So solar may be part of that paradigm shift. Changes in human behavior will be part of that paradigm shift. And when I see children and students worldwide taking action and joining the movement, I am certain that we can and will be able to address climate change. My only hope is that we're not too late. Jessica, your top 7 went to the top. We'll take a look at those as I scroll down here. There is no penalty to not being part of the Paris Agreement. Paris Agreement, these are voluntary contributions. However, I would say the real penalty is future-proofing your economy. The future of the world is renewable energy. The future of the world is low carbon or zero carbon development. And the future of protecting biodiversity is preservation. This is good for our economy, it's good for our society, and it's good for our world. And Illinois is part of those states doing their part. So, do I have any more questions coming there? I think we're hitting the end of our time, but I would urge you to go hit up Amazon, check out my book, head to your library, check out books about climate change, conservation, and head to the streets, you guys, and tell the world that we need to take action and that your voice needs to be heard.